In the name of the one and only, we are beginning the next session of the Indigo firmament. We are in the discussion of the perception of Islam in the course of history. However, in the previous session, we had a discussion as to how a warrior culture versus a pacifist culture evolves. And the thesis I presented was that it largely depends on where you live. In other words, the land, the natural environment, the type of land that you live in a way determines who you become as a culture, as a society, and by who we meant to say whether you become a warrior culture or a pacifist culture. We will pursue that a little bit further with other examples today. The argument that I'm making today is to go further east into China and to seek what influence Islam had on China and the Far East, and whether that perception was one of war or of peace, a positive one or a negative one. And a lot of us, again, because China is kind of detached geographically, most of us have a hard time relating to it when we are talking about the connection between China and the Muslim world. Before we go to that, let me make this other argument, which was the subject of the previous session. That is, the argument that I made was that a pastoral society is more warlike because they have to search for resources. And that resources, the search for the resources demand moving and migrating to other lands. Being in another land automatically implies a sense of insecurity. You don't know your environment, so you need to be protective. You need to be defensive. And sometimes moving from one land to another results in encounters, and encounters in the past more so, but also now in the present times, in modern times, encounters often entails misunderstanding that can be blamed on linguistic problems, miscommunication, and so on, as well as the body language, the attitude, how you perceive of the others, how you feel you have a sense of entitlement or a sense of belonging, a sense of cultural supremacy, and many of these contribute one way or another to a war when you are on the move. And so in East Asia, and I mean primarily in Northeast Asia, two cultures have evolved very differently in respect to what we are discussing: pastoral versus agrarian, or mountainous versus coastal, or lands of intersectional crossroads versus lands of plenty and all that. And those are the Turco-Altaic cultures of Northern Asia, that is Northeastern Asia, and primarily the Chinese culture, which is to the south. The Turco-Altaic are the people that stretch from Japan all the way to Turkey and parts of Bulgaria and Eastern Europe. These are people who live between the Altai Mountains, and primarily they are Turkic, but they're also Mongolian. The Tatars and their other sub-ethnic groups or ethnic groups within the general Turco-Altaic realm. Now, originally they were pastoral people. They had herds of animals. Now, as they moved to other places, for instance, the Japanese that moved to these islands, and the islands sort of demands a different lifestyle, and so perhaps they became more agrarian. You could say pretty much the same about the Koreans. But those who went west, when there was no shortage of land and they could go as far as they want to, and as far as they could afford to, and as far as they could fight other people, and in fighting them, they learned more war skills. They perhaps gathered more weapons, and that probably made them more versatile in their war skills, and therefore those who moved west, where they could use and learn from the tactics of one battle and use them effectively in the next one and surprise others, became great warriors. So if you do a kind of contrastive analysis of this, who are the great heroes of the Turco-Altaic people? Obviously, we cannot ignore but to mention the fact that it would be Attila the Hun, it could be Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan. These are their heroes. These are their role models. And these are great warriors. And so therefore, the Turco-Altaic culture can be identified as a warrior culture. Even those who moved to places like Japan that I mentioned earlier, island countries, again, the warrior culture was very prominent there. The Meiji Japan, and also we had the hierarchical structures of the daimyos and the samurais, that the art of war was developed into what we know as Kung Fu and the other martial arts that have evolved there. They have their root in war. Yes, there could be a different interpretation for its use in modern times, self-defense, etc., etc. But there's no denying that war had played a warrior cultural mindset had played a role in that. Even in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, for some reason, not to my liking, of course, is that the national sport in Afghanistan is buzkashi, which is a war game or a war tactic that had been employed by the invading armies, and unfortunately that has become the symbol of the or rather the national sport of Afghanistan. And I am a pacifist. I'm against war in every form, and I personally would rather see Afghanistan adopt a different sport as a national sport rather than buzkashi. And buzkashi is basically dragging a goat or a calf over which the team players or opposing team players fight to grab it and lift it up and carry it. And yes, it has skills and tactics and all that, but it is, like I said, a war game or a war tactic. And again, this comes from the Turco-Altaic people. So if the great heroes of the Turco-Altaic people are people of war, how would we contrast with the people of China to the south? And China being more agrarian or coastal community, not a pastoral community. The great heroes of China are Lao Tzu and Kung Fu Tzu, or Confucius, as we know him by his anglicized name. So Lao Tzu is the great teacher. Gang Fuzi is also a teacher. So their heroes are not warriors. Their heroes are teachers. And teachers teach rather than fight a war. And if you look at the whole culture, again, the whole culture of China, and contrasting it with the culture of further north of the Turk-Altaic, that is very, very evident in there. Yes, the Chinese didn't like the Mongolians, and probably not the Turks either. And yes, they built a great wall against them. But they built a wall. And the wall was there because there were common incursions from the north into the south. Again, that is a sign and symbol of great warrior culture, a clash of culture, where the warrior culture is frequently invading a relatively pacifist culture. China had these huge empires. Yes, it had armies, it had bureaucracies, it had military campaigns. There is no denial of that. So we are not defining a warrior culture. In other words, war is not necessarily the domain, the exclusive domain of a warrior culture, but it's the mentality that is theirs exclusively. We can discuss that in the Islamic context too, but I think it's very striking to notice that in the Turco-Altai culture, Attila and Genghis Khan are the models as warriors, whereas in the Chinese culture, Lao Tzu and Confucius, the teachers are the role models. Now, what does that have to do with the perception of Islam in the course of history? If we can bridge these two arguments, then we have to go no further than to go to the life of one individual by the name of Jing He. And Jing He was a great Chinese admiral. He was, his family now obviously is Jing, but he was a Muslim. The Muslims had a heavy influence in China, and for that we have to go to the argument of the age of exploration. I think that Christopher Columbus may have discovered America, which is great for the Europeans, a disaster for the Native Americans. That's obvious. But Columbus is also a disaster for the people of Asia, because prior to Columbus, Asian societies were more land societies. Their main roads were going through lands. And that allowed for a lot more exchange in trade and in business and in cultural exchanges as well. And so Indians and Chinese and Central Asians and Afghans and Iranians and Persians and Arabs and Turks, they all would be traveling these long roads of caravans and the Silk Road and so on and so forth. So the Silk Road in Central Asia, or the Great Trunk Road in northern India, became the veins, became the fiber, became the source for connecting different peoples within these great geographic regions. And that's what I mean when I say that these were land cultures, that they were centered on land. Most of the traveling was in land. Most of the orientation was in these lands. What happened with Columbus is that the land roads were replaced by the sea routes. And so the sea voyages that connected Europe with Asia and Africa and the Americas took away from the significance of lands. In other words, the Silk Road became just a memory. The Trunk Road was probably ignored altogether, although you could make an argument that it remained effective until much, much later. So it was during that earlier period, that is a pre-Columbian period, when land was important, that there was a great interaction and exchange between China and Central Asia, and lands that are now Persia, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and the rest. So the modern day excursions of China, or its attempt to reach this market, is in a way rooted in a lot of historical precedents. So it was during this time that a man by the name of Zheng He, who was whose ancestors probably traveled from Central Asia, probably from Iran or Afghanistan to China. And so that shows that there was a large Muslim community in China. Not just a Muslim community, but that they were a kind of an involved community in the power structure of the Chinese society at the time. He was born in 1371 and died in 1435. So that's again a long span, of his own life in a way, but an effective one. That his original name is Ma He, and I think the word Ma also implies horse, and it's a common name among Chinese Muslims. I know several Chinese Muslim friends today with the same name. Now, whether that Ma implies any connection with the pastoral people who would have had the herds of horses and all that's a different story. And of course, all of that is if my assumption of his name Ma is correct, to be translated as a horse. Zheng He is known for conducting several expeditionary voyages through South Asia, and Western Asia. And most of these were from 1405 to 1433, and it's pretty much the second half of his life. And his larger ships, he built this huge fleet, of which he was, of course, an admiral. And this was the most impressive because compared to what the Europeans could do at the time, and by that mean, in this particular respect, to draw a contrast between Christopher Columbus begging Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand for money so that he could have a ship, and the Queen found that her treasury was all empty because of her campaigns against the Muslims in Granada to the south. And so all that Columbus could muster was to build 3 rather small ships of, I think, Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. But to compare that with what Zheng He was commanding in the seas of Asia and the Indian Ocean, was that his largest ship stretched 120 meters in length. That comes to over 400 feet, if my calculation is off the cuff calculation is right. 120 meters long, and Santa Maria was only 26 meters. So this shows who the real superpower at the time was. And of course, times change, but these ships, in addition, carried hundreds of sailors on 4 tiers of decks, and as a favor of the Yongle Emperor, who assisted Zheng He to rise to prominence as an admiral. They were prominent in the East China Sea and in the Indian Ocean, and they had several significances in terms of the actual voyages that I think were conducted between 1404, as I said earlier, and 1433. The first voyage was taken to Java, and that is in Champa. Those will be the islands in what was called the East Indies. The second one was again between 1407 and 1409. This would take him to Java and further to Siam. And then the third one, I think, went to Malaysia, and then eventually he, in the fourth voyage between 1413 and 1415, he went to Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called then, Cochin, Aden, which would be Yemen, Muscat, which is further north, the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and then in the fifth voyage, as 1417 to 1419, that would take him to Calcutta and places further inland into the inner waters of the Bay of Bengal. And of course he reached Bengal in the sixth voyage, and in the seventh one again he follows pretty much the same route, starting with Champa and Java to Lakshadweep and the Maldive Islands. In other words, through these 7 voyages that Zheng He had, he went to many of the lands and the islands and the lands adjacent to the Indian Ocean, and this would have been the exploratory equivalent of what Columbus discovered. Columbus had to discover India from Europe, and he went the other way, of course, but to Zheng He, India was around the corner, and so most of these were lands in the Indian Ocean or around the Indian subcontinent. What was also important is that Zheng He also brought a lot of these leaders of these small states to pay homage to to the Chinese emperor in Nanjing, which was the capital of China at the time. Nanjing was, the capital was later moved from Nanjing to Beijing, which is the current capital of China. And so he was, in a way, using a lot of his travels, his explorations, to not only do business with these people, but also to bring a lot of these the local leaders to pay homage to the Chinese emperor And so therefore he was instrumental in establishing a kind of alliances or loose federations or lines of affiliations, or what we could call in modern times these pacts, such as NATO, for example. That is strictly a military organization, but in terms of a pact, it brings many nations into a kind of a union for defense or aggression, depending on how you look at it. We also have the European Union, a different kind of union, and we had, I think, the British Commonwealth, and the French had another one where their colonies was trying to, I think, model, whether this was consciously or subconsciously, these would be all things that were modeled on Zhenghi's role in Asia, where he created these pacts, economic and political pacts of creating great alliances for China to have extensive influence far beyond its geographic borders. The other significant role that Zhenghi played was through his fleet of these huge ships was to bring Chinese products. So trade became a manifestation of a cultural prowess for the Chinese, that these huge ships would be landing in on the various port cities throughout Asia and the eastern coast of Africa. In other words, the whole region of the Indian Ocean had become sort of a trade zone, a free trade zone, where commodities would be exchanged and people would bring whatever they produce, say the Persians, the Arabs, the Africans, the Indians, the Chinese. So in other words, in this trade zone, you had these huge ships loaded with merchandise, with handicraft or whatever else they produced, and this would be exchanged in this sea free trade zones, or the free trade zones on floating free trade zones, if we can call them that. And but in my opinion, the greater significance of Zhenghi is that as he traveled through these seas and the Indian Ocean, and had ports of call on the various islands, say in the Philippines and in what we today know as the Philippines, and what we today know as Indonesia and Malaysia and all that, that he himself, being a Muslim, was a very strict disciplinarian. He was very strict with what is it called? With pirates. He was ruthless with pirates. He was obviously an honest trader, and in that case, the pirates would have been his terrorists, to superimpose a modern day terminology. So with the terrorists, with the pirates, he was very ruthless. However, with the people, he was very let's see, very peaceful, very accommodating, and very understanding in terms of the cultural exchanges and all that. So every time he made a when he entered a port city, he would have all his sailors kind of be very disciplined, respect the local culture, the people's way of life, and all that. And he would most probably, as a Muslim, be conducting his daily prayers, the call for prayers. And this contrasted a great deal with other sailors who obviously would have been more aggressive, more defensive, and not so willing to mingle with people. And as a result of this, the influence and the modeling of this type of a personality, who was friendly and, shall we say, soft and gentle, and had a human face, while at the same time he was the greatest admiral that China had ever known. So from a position of authority, from a position of strength, from a position of power, he was very gentle. And this is what made a lot of those people curious as to how is this possible? Yeah, we have the European model, the ancient Greek model of the philosopher king, where kings, instead of being aggressive and warmongers and warlike, what if they had used their philosophy, their mind, more than the strength of their arms and their weapons? So Zheng He modeled that, and as a result, he had a great influence on most of the people of these islands. And there's no doubt that it was this kind of modeling, this kind of influence, this kind of cultural exchange that eventually turned all of these islands into where people converted to Islam. So the Philippines were all Muslim. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world today, by far, bigger than any other, Malaysia and the rest of it. And of course we know that eventually when the Europeans went, when the Spanish went and found out that the people in these archipelago in east of China were Muslim, King Philip made it his mission that, as sensitive as he was to Islam as a religion, he said that, well, we got rid of the Moors here in Spain and on the Iberian Peninsula, and now they pop up in places like the Far East. So he commissioned an admiral, actually a Portuguese admiral, to convert all of them to to Catholicism. So the Filipinos who were Muslims, due to the influence of people such as Zheng He and the other sailors and traders from the Muslim lands, they were forced converted into Catholicism. The term forced might be used mildly because the Portuguese admiral basically changed the names of the Muslims into Catholic names, the names that the Filipinos to this day retain, and therefore imply that these had become Catholics. And they would have become Catholics in the course of time with all that, but the point is that originally they were all Muslim. And Indonesia, as I mentioned earlier. And that is, going back to the argument we had earlier, is that when you compare, at least in modern day politics, where Islam is often equated with terrorism, where Muslim lands are lands of war and political conflicts, where Muslim lands are lands of invasions and all that, Indonesia stands in a class by itself. And it can be contrasted with all of the descriptives of the Muslim lands. It's very peaceful. There are conflicts, yes, but not major ones such as those in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan today. And the other argument that can be made is that how did the argument that is generally made that Islam has been spread by the sword? That argument is completely not applicable in terms of the historical evidence. And no armies had, Muslim armies had invaded the Indonesian islands, and no armies had forced converted or spread Islam by the sword in Indonesia. Rather, it had all come through trade and business, and in that trade, the role of Zheng is very, very prominent to this day. I should say, I don't know, in respect to his origin, I think I did mention that his ancestor had originally come from Central Asia, probably from Persia, but the term Persia was used much more extensively then, and it would have applied to be the Persianate region of Central Asia rather than a country as such. And I think his grandfather's or great-great-great-grandfather's name was Said Ajal Shamsuddin Omar. And the word Omar, again, in modern terminology, the cultural sensitivities in modern-day Iran, is another indication that Iranians were not Shias at the time, but that's a different argument. Let's move on to further to the fact that Zheng He being in the service of the Ming army, the Ming dynasty, that he was originally a prince, and that there were certain invasions, and that he was captured, and there was that's the whole story of his early childhood and how he found his way there. But that may not be too relevant to the topic we are discussing. What I'm interested in is that the comparison we made earlier in the program in respect to a warrior culture and a pacifist culture, and I think the argument that I made was that compared to the role model of Attila and Genghis Khan, Zheng He is certainly very, very different. Yes, he was a great admiral, and the rank of admiral is often perceived to be more in the context of the military. But I think his would have been more correctly defined more in the context of a discoverer. And again, we can compare Zheng He with Columbus in a different way. Columbus came from the land of, for lack of a better term, from the land of the hungry Europeans who hungered for the spices of China, who hungered for coffee and tea and all the foods of the Middle East, who hungered for the silk and so on and so forth. So there was a prevalence of deprivation in the Europe of that time, the Europe that was cornered and kind of trapped in its geographic cage in the northwest cold climate of the Europe of the time. And it's from there where Europeans simply come and find out that the rest of the world lives in plenty. And eventually Europe gets all its foods from Africa, from Asia, from America, and one could imagine what the Europeans must have been living on as a source of food before all these foods came to them or were brought to them. But the contrastive argument between Zheng He and Columbus is that Columbus came from this land of the hungry, and he was there for a loot, whether he wanted the gold or he wanted the foods or he wanted the slaves, or he wanted the resources, he went, of course, along with other Europeans, Cortes, Balboa, and the other conquistadors that came to Americas. Their main objective was to get as much gold as they could get from these lands, and along with it came the foods and the things that they got. And the part on the food would be just the the mere fact of the human curiosity that the foods they had in America. Take potato alone, for example. Potato helped Europe survive the harsh winters because it was a food that was available to the largely rural communities who were hungry, who could not store food, who could not have a lot of food. So potato was very convenient. You could harvest them, it was easy. You could store them underground, and you didn't have to worry about either refrigeration or other methods that we use in modern times, of course. But it ended a lot of hunger, a lot of starvation, a lot of diseases for the Europeans. We're just talking about potato. The other foods would have equally influenced life in Europe. Now, so the argument I'm making is that Columbus and other Europeans went to basically plunder other lands in America and Africa and in Asia. Zheng He did the exact opposite. He took his fleet full of merchandise and craft and foods and spices and things, and he traded with them. In other words, he was not there for the loot. He was there for trade and business. And the great encounter between these two cultures come again in the Indian Ocean, is that after the Pope declared that 300 miles west of the Canary Islands, off of the coast of Spain, from that imaginary line, north-south, that everything to the west was the domain of Spain, and everything to the east of that would be the territory for the Portuguese to go to conquer and to convert, and obviously then to plunder as well. So when the Portuguese went south along the west coast of Africa, and then were eventually able to reach the port of or the the Good Hope along the southern tip of Africa, and came around towards the east coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean. Here was another clash of cultures, or perhaps even of civilizations, and this is very significant, because when the Portuguese arrived into this region of northern Indian Ocean, the Portuguese attitude was one of military conquest, like I said before, one of land grab, one of stealing and claiming, and everywhere they went, they planted the Portuguese flag and claimed that land for themselves, for the King of Portugal. So whether it was Mozambique and Zanzibar and the other coastal cities along the eastern coast of Africa, or whether it was on the coast of the Indian subcontinent, Goa, that was liberated, taken over by the Indian government in, I think, 1962, or whether it's Macau in China, that is still Portuguese. So this was the attitude of the Portuguese, is to to lay claim to a land, and we have reminiscence of that also even in our space age. The first thing that Americans did on the moon was to stick an American flag there. It's ours. And it's a very European thing to do. And of course we know how Columbus also claimed America for the Queen of Spain, and the Native Americans would have been kind of baffled by it, like, what is it supposed to be, or what does it signify? To the non-Europeans, this was kind of a strange thing. But what happened in the Indian Ocean was that, yes, the Portuguese planted their flags in as many of these port cities that they went to. But when they encountered these huge fleet of Chinese ships and the Indians and the Persians and probably the Turks and the Arabs and the East Africans and all that, who were busy doing trade and business, exchanging commodities, selling and buying craft and textile and silk and whatever else, spices, food and all that. The Portuguese had nothing to offer. In other words, the Portuguese sailors were warriors from a warrior culture in faraway land of Europe, whereas most of these people were not of warrior cultures. The Turks being the exception, and I don't know if they were that involved in here at that time, probably not. So the end result was that at one point the Portuguese found themselves in such a disadvantage of not being competitive that they went back and mounted huge guns on top of their ships and brought them back to the Indian Ocean and started shooting at these ships, sinking them. In other words, the Portuguese were the first terrorists in this free trade zone of the Indian Ocean. And people were stunned as to why would someone do that? Because that was the only way the Portuguese could become dominant and the Portuguese could take over and that they could become somebody's, because otherwise, compared to the Chinese and the Indians and the rest, they were nothing. They like I said, they didn't have anything to offer other than their guns and their military force. And so after this whole free trade zone was in essence destroyed, interrupted, after this terrorist act, the Portuguese were able to establish themselves as the authority, as the military authority. And then again, another European kind of thinking was that they had to create monopolies. And these monopolies were trade monopolies. And for instance, the Portuguese gave themselves the monopoly of trading in pepper, which was something new to them. I think they brought millions of whatever the currency at the time would have been to the coffers of the Portuguese kingdom at the time, simply through the monopoly of peppers. And so again, we are looking at, in the general context of a warrior culture versus a pacifist or a peace culture, and we compared now Zheng He to Columbus in that sense, see how it's different. And we compared Zheng He as a Chinese admiral, yes, but how he dealt with the people that he encountered in the White Seas compared to, say, Genghis Khan or Attila. And that's where I try to draw lines between this identifying a warrior culture than in terms of how and where they have originated. Again, you are the product of the land in which you live, and the argument that I'm making was that in the land of the plenty, people are more pacifist. They love peace, of course. They don't want any disturbance because there's no reason for them to resort to war. Whereas in the land where there's shortage of food and resources, whereas in the land of, say, a deprivation, for lack of a better term, or in lands that are geographically kind of the resources are not accessible to the average people. Mountainous regions, and also we call for political reasons the crossroads. Those lands will produce different people. So in the general context of the East-West, then my conclusion is that yes, the European culture is a warrior culture because of the deprivations. And one could argue, then what about America? Well, even in America, it is the European mindset that is operating here. Because otherwise, America is the land of plenty. We have plenty of resources. So Americans shouldn't be warmongers. But because the mindset comes from Europe, and that's why even when there is plenty, people want more. And that's what greed is. Greed is to want more beyond your needs. That is greed. So we're not talking about basic necessity, but going beyond it. So many of the incursions of Americans, whether it's in Latin America or in Asia or in the Middle East, it doesn't have to be for food. It can be for oil, it could be for minerals, it could be for other resources, rare earth minerals in Afghanistan, for instance, denationalizing the the Iraqi oil, and so on and so forth. So again, this is at some level for resources, and the American involvement in the war in Yemen, on the side of Saudi Arabia, who are basically our managers of the resources that we Americans are really involved in. So in that sense, the resources and the warrior culture that might have been shaped by lack of resources in the hunter-gatherer societies, and subsequently in the in the pastoral versus agrarian societies, that mindset has, that condition has shaped our mindset and has been doing so for centuries. And so therefore we have the European culture as a warrior culture. Now on the Muslim side, we talked about the Turco-Altai or the Turco-Mongolian culture, again having originated in pastoral society and perhaps hunter-gatherer society, and has evolved more as a warrior culture. And so even when then it adopted Islam as its religion, in other words, Islam cannot be blamed for the Turkic culture's warrior mentality, and Christianity cannot be blamed for the warrior culture of the European mindset. So in a sense, both Islam and Christianity, as two relatively peaceful religions, were in a way changed and made more warlike by the Europeans and by the Turco-Mongolians. So when you look at the earlier period of Islamic history, you had with the exception of the Umayyads, Islam expanded on its own merits as a religion. And for centuries, Muslims were minorities in their own lands because there was no coercion and there was no forced conversion. And I'm speaking in general term. There is no doubt that some such incidences must have occurred. However, with the coming of the Seljuks, the Seljuk Turks, and then the Mongols, and then the conversion of those into Islam, made Islam, or at least that particular aspect of it, more warlike, more a warrior culture. India was only partially converted to Islam in a very peaceful way by the Arabs, but most of the forced conversions occurred by, again, these Turco-Mongolian invasions from the north. The same can be said again from the time of the within Europe to some extent. So the argument stands as follows, that some cultures are warrior cultures by the nature of their environmental nature. Many societies that live in the land of plenty, on the other hand, are more pacifists. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with cultural stereotyping, which we should avoid at all costs. And we should avoid stereotyping this with any particular religious community, religious affiliation, or religious belief system. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with a particular culture, whether it's defined linguistically or ethnically or otherwise, but rather it's perhaps triggered by the necessity of an environment of deprivation in which people become more defensive, and when you are successful defending, sometimes your defensive nature turns into an offensive one, and that cultural mindset evolves from there on. So the perception of Islam, which is our discussion, will be taken up in the next session. I only wanted to hint here that, at least briefly speaking, that Zheng He had established a very, very positive perception of Islam, and it was because of this positive perception that large swaths of lands and island archipelagos such as the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and all that had become Muslim without any war campaigns or military campaigns for that matter. We have come to the end of this session. We'll take up the general topic of the perception of Islam throughout history and delve into another excursions into another part of the world in our next session. And for today, I bid you peace. Have a nice day, and hope things turn out more peaceful for the world than they are.